G'day, Paul Jones is my name. I go to New Life Brizzy and I'm the principal of Trinity College, Queensland. And it's my pleasure to bring you 4 studies on the book of Hosea. Now, Hosea is a fascinating book, also a pretty confronting one and a complex one. So with just 4 studies, we're going to be focusing on the narrative at the beginning, Hosea chapters 1 to 3. In a nutshell, this is the historical record of a prophet from the 8th century BC. So we're talking a long time ago, 3,000 years. And it's about a prophet who marries a local prostitute, then has 3 kids with her and gives them all pretty awful names to send a message to the onlooking community, who are obviously watching with great interest. But come on, to what end? Like who does this kind of thing? And what is Hosea's game plan? Well, those are exactly the kinds of questions that we're going to be exploring together in these studies. Who does this kind of thing? Israel's prophets of Yahweh. And Hosea's game plan? Well, to make the heart of God known to his people. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. There are 2 questions that we're going to need to address more fully in order to understand Hosea's strange actions. First, we need to ask, is this bizarre behavior out of the blue, or is there some sort of precedent for it? Has this kind of thing happened before in Israel? And secondly, is there anything about Hosea's cultural context that would help us to understand why he would marry a prostitute, then send her away, and then try to win her love back again? Now, the answer to both those questions is actually yes. Yes, other prophets also performed enacted parables like this, and that's study 1, enacted parables. And yes, Hosea's cultural context makes perfect sense of his strange actions, and that'll be study 2, which I've called love triangles. We'll see what that means when we get there. And then we're in a better position with those 2 questions answered to understand the names that Hosea gives his kids in Hosea 1 and 2. And that's study 3. What's in a name? And then, finally, we'll be in a better position to ask ourselves, what kind of message are we communicating to the world around us in our own sort of enacted parables, the lives that we live? And you guessed it, that is study 4, which I've called embodying the word. So let's dive in. Symbolic actions. Can you think of any? There's a whole bunch of symbolic actions that we do on a fairly regular basis. And some of them don't really make that much sense, but we do them anyway because we're just accustomed to it. Others of them we can sort of tell that there is some sense or there's a story behind it. You go to a soccer game and you'll see the referee grabbing yellow or red cards out of their pockets and just holding them up if a player gets aggressive or breaks the rules. Now, the ref doesn't say what it means, he just holds it up, and it's expected that the players know what those cards mean. You go to a wedding, you'll see 2 people putting little metal bands onto each other's fingers as they make promises to each other. Why do we do that? A person might wear black clothing for a week after the death or the loss of someone who was precious to them. What does that mean? A judge in a courtroom slams down that wooden hammer, don't they? So that everyone in the room knows that the final decision has been made. And towards the end of the year, we all, well, most of us, I think, get hold of this is a bit of a weird one, get hold of a fake Christmas tree, a fake tree. We put it up in our houses and hang a whole bunch of random baubles and objects off it. I know I'm not sounding very enthusiastic. I'm not a Scrooge, I promise. But these are all examples of symbolic actions, right? They're patterns of behavior that have a special meaning. And usually there's some kind of story or narrative behind them. And it's well known in the Old Testament that God spoke to his people through prophets, right? A prophet always began with, "Thus says the Lord," which indicates they spoke what was the heart and mind of God. Less well known is that one of the ways the prophets communicated with God's people in the Old Testament was through symbolic actions, what we sometimes refer to as enacted parables. Now, we all know what a parable is, right? It's basically a story with a point. Well, enacted parables are the same, only without the words. They're enacted. It's an action or a series of actions that invites questions and that means something. You may know that parables aren't always easy to understand, right? You have to dig a bit. You have to ask some questions to get at their meaning. So, for example, in Luke 5:36, Jesus says, "No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it onto an old garment. Otherwise, the new will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old." Now, that makes some sense, but we know that we need to ask some questions. Jesus, can you tell us what these garments represent? We're pretty sure that you weren't speaking at a tailor's convention, so I reckon these garments that you speak of are probably symbolic. What exactly do they represent? Tell us more. And the same goes for enacted parables. The prophet would do some strange action, and the people watching would say, Ezekiel, what are you doing? Why are you cooking your dinner over animal dung? What's going on? What does that mean? One of the best analogies that we have for this is street theatre. When you see someone on the street and they're performing some kind of action or mime, and often they will use props, and a crowd will gather to watch as this performer gathers everyone's interest. And that's essentially what we're talking about here. But once the crowd had gathered around the prophet would do something strange, and the crowd would ask, "What are you doing? Why are you cutting off your beautiful beard with that sword, Ezekiel? And Ahijah, you just bought that new cloak. Why are you now tearing it into 12 pieces?" So let me give you a few examples from the Bible, and you can look these up in your groups if you like. In Ezekiel 5, Ezekiel cuts off all of his beard with a sword, I guess, and divides it into 3 parts. 1/3 of that he sets on fire with the lighter that's in his back pocket. 1/3 of it he cuts with a sword, and the last third he scatters it to the wind. And then he explains that by saying that destruction is coming, and 1/3 of you are going to be burnt up or destroyed when the city is burnt and destroyed. 1/3 of you are going to die by the sword, and 1/3 of you are going to be scattered. It's a pretty serious message with what seems like a simple image. In 1 Kings 12, a prophet, I mentioned Ahijah earlier, he tears his cloak into 12 pieces, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and he gives 10 of them to Rehoboam, saying, God is entrusting you to rule over the 10 northern tribes. And the symbolic action reinforces his prophetic word. An interesting one in 1 Kings 22, you get these 2 groups of prophets telling a king different things. Now Zedekiah, the false prophet, he pulls out some iron horns. It's one of those "here's one I prepared earlier" moments. And he tells Israel's king that like a bull, he's going to gore the enemy with these horns. And the last one is Isaiah 20. Bit of an odd one, but the prophet is asked by God to walk around butt naked for 3 years as an enacted parable. Now that one must have got a little bit weird, don't you reckon? After the first week, he was taken off the worship roster. Would have been okay if he played the bass or the drums, but Isaiah had to be out there playing the flute, didn't he? After a few more weeks, his small group leader had to have the chat. Isaiah, mate, either put some clothes on or find another small group, maybe a nudist one. But seriously, as you can imagine, because of their total obedience to God, these prophets were often perceived as misfits, weirdos. And there are lots and lots of examples in the Old Testament, and I love talking about them, as you can probably tell. But one of the most powerful enacted parables in the entire Bible is the one that we'll be looking at in these studies. So before I see you next week, have a read of Hosea chapter 1 and reflect on the study questions for this week with your small group. In the next study, we'll be looking at Hosea's cultural context a bit, and I'll see you then.